Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Truth Wanted, the Collins Show every Friday night, where we want to know what you believe and why. Start calling us in with your supernatural claims or religious beliefs, because tonight, as with every week, we have a very special guest, and tonight we have someone who is no stranger to taking calls from people on the internet, Arden of Eden. Hello, Arden.
Hey, Puck, thanks for having me. I'm excited. It's my first time on Truth Wanted, so
That
I'm
that
pumped.
buzz never goes away. My first time on Truth Wanted was last October, and I'm still like, I can't believe I'm doing these shows. It's so much fun. And
Definitely.
speaking of shows, you're no stranger to doing shows. What are you? What's your big project right now?
So right now, my good friend Katie Montgomery, who I think has been on Truth Wanted before, she and I started a call-in show a little over a month ago, close to 2 months ago now, actually, called the Transatlantic Call-in Show, where we take calls on issues that are anything and everything related to being trans or trans issues. Those questions that are maybe uncomfortable for people to ask their trans friends or peers or whoever, or maybe people who think that trans people have an obligation to disclose their trans status to someone who they could potentially be dating. Any of those controversial topics related to trans issues, we take calls on that.
And I think it's fantastic that there is a forum for that. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I wish that there didn't have to be, but I'm glad that there are people who are willing to be standard bearers and to take those calls. Which leads us to what I wanted to talk about today, which is how to have those difficult conversations when you do have the questions. You're well-meaning, just underinformed, and don't know where to start. Now, one quick answer would be you do some research on your own and quote unquote Google it. The problem is there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Yeah, I think there's misinformation out there, and sometimes you don't even always know exactly what to Google. Like you might not even know necessarily what string of keywords is going to get you the answer that you're kind of searching for. Whereas if you have a person, maybe you can stumble through not wording it correctly or not understanding something exactly. But if you can get that core idea through to them, you can usually get to the kind of answer you're looking for. So
No,
yeah.
and I think that's great that they are out there. But the one of the difficulties is that you go on somewhere like Twitter, you go on somewhere like Facebook, and you see that we're about halfway into these conversations already, and it it seems like a hostile battleground sometimes. And to be frank, sometimes it should be when people need to stand their ground and say no, this is what's what. But it also seems to create an air, at least to some people, that I'm not even allowed to ask questions. If I have a well intentioned question about this, I'm going to be put in the camp of the phobics. So what would you say to those people, and how can we have some meaningful outreach to them?
Well, I mean, first, I think if, you know, a substantial number of people are calling you transphobic or homophobic when you're just asking questions,
Mm.
maybe consider the fact that your question is inherently transphobic in some capacity. Maybe you're projecting some sort of prejudice through that question. But assume in good faith, um, I think a really good way to do it is to kind of try to preamble a little bit, like explain to the person that I respect you as a human. I like really am coming at this from a place of wanting knowledge, not from wanting to confirm biases. I don't want to get you trapped in a gotcha. I genuinely have a question that I want answered. I think most trans people, at least the ones that I've spoken to, and as a trans person, I think I'm pretty plugged into the community. Um, I think most of us are willing to answer questions when the interlocutor is approaching us in good faith. I think the issue is just that a lot of the times with these conversations, when people are just asking questions, the questions are inherently kind of demeaning on some level. But again, if you've watched Transatlantic, we've had tons of callers who their entire question is riddled with language that is cringeworthy and probably a little offensive to a lot of trans people, but they were calling in good faith. And so we would answer their question. And then after the fact, after we hung up, we would explain to the audience, like, hey, I recognize that the caller was using this term, and that we maybe even used it to kind of like speak to them from like where they were coming from, but like we acknowledge that maybe this isn't the most appropriate term or the best way to handle things. So yeah, I think there's a level of just like respecting someone, establishing that you respect someone's humanity before diving into what could be a potentially hurtful question.
Yeah, because I see this happen on our Facebook groups and on our Discord. Plug, join the ACA Discord. And where it starts out okay, and then it something happens. A word or phrase gets used, and then gently corrected, and then the feedback is not received properly.
Sure.
Yeah. So
Sorry, go on.
No. So these conversations are difficult enough to have already, and it takes some courage to go out there and have from both sides, I would say, to have the courage to be willing to answer the questions, and then be brave enough to come up with these questions to ask. But what are some, you said preambling, but how can you make sure that in conversation as it continues that you're not, say, burning out your interlocutor or starting to step on lines you shouldn't?
I think if you are doing a genuinely honest job of preambling and respecting the person you're talking to, I think at that point it does kind of become incumbent on them to honestly communicate their state of being too. And I want to make a message to like trans people who are maybe on the other side of this, who are being questioned, that you are empowered to set boundaries down. If someone's asking questions and they're continually kind of invading or crossing certain lines and you're getting exhausted, I think that's more something I want to direct to the trans people to say, nope, I understand you are genuinely coming at this from like an honest point of view, but the questions you're asking are starting to burn me out, and I think it'd be better if we pick this up another time, or if I give you maybe some like Google links at another time. Like you can never, perfectly protect yourself or others from being hurt or exhausted or triggered or what have you. I think it's a matter of genuinely respecting people's boundaries and being willing to lay clear ones yourself.
And from working with you on nonprofits, plug, what we are talking about here, viewers, is someone who does the research, who knows the studies, who has this stuff on bookmark, and is happy to provide this. I'm always so flattered when I come up with hey, let's talk about this on nonprofits, and then Arden comes in with paragraphs on there about, oh, let's look at this study over here, and let's look at all this on top of. We have someone who is very, very informed here, and also on top of that, you put yourself in the line of fire. So that must be a little exhausting. What makes you want to do a show like that?
Well, I grew up kind of with a lot of. I grew up in an environment with a person who was a narcissist. They like to gaslight a lot. So I developed in response a sort of pathological need to be right and need to know for sure I'm right and how I'm right. So I became a very empirical person because of that. And growing up, I got a degree in psychology when I was in college, which involved like a lot of research and research methodology. So for me, I like being right and I like arguing, and I also care deeply about the lives of trans kids and that they don't have to suffer in the ways that I have suffered in the past. So for me, a lot of these conversations is it exhausting sometimes? Yeah, a little bit. But at the end of the day, I have good friends. I have good coping mechanisms. I have good ways to replenish myself when I'm gone. I take a lot of care of my mental health, a lot of intentional care of my mental health. And so maybe there's a bit of like a martyr complex there too that is maybe like problematic in some capacity. But really, it comes from like, I have the resources and the knowledge and the privilege to be able to do this stuff and to walk away okay, and to know that I have a community and tools to handle it. Whereas there are kids who are being threatened of having their healthcare taken away who don't have those resources, who may not have the supportive like family or community around them. So for me, it's more about wanting to make clear uh, why trans people deserve access to healthcare, and why the fight for some of this language is more about like our dignity, and changing broad cultural perceptions of prejudice against trans people that impact our ability to get housing and jobs and just form relationships and things like that. It's really about like, I feel like a very secure person at this point in my life. And so I do this more in mind that hopefully minds will change, so that young trans people growing up have it slightly easier, and that they can eventually pass the torch on to the generation after that.
Yeah, one of the things that I try to plug is that you never owe anybody conversation, right? Like if you are done, then if I'm not even trying to begin to compare the two. They're not the same in scope. But I've been the only atheist in a workplace before. And there are some times when I'm usually happy to entertain questions about my beliefs and whatnot, but there are some times when I'm just like, no. And especially with family, especially with friends, it's good to set those boundaries. And if you don't want to have those conversations at that time, that's fine. You don't have to have them. And that's great that there are standard bearers like you who are putting yourselves out there and in the line of fire and handling all these difficult questions. And now, as you are doing that, though, knowing that you're going to be getting very difficult callers, have you noticed that like what's your ratio of well-meaning callers to actual just want to argue with you callers?
To be honest, on Transatlantic so far, I would say all but like maybe two have been genuinely good faith people. Most of them are honestly trans people who are looking for advice to deal with difficult situations and family members and so forth. But we've only had probably two people who were genuinely like kind of assholes. I know in the most recent episode, everyone laughed because it was the first time that we've hung up on anyone, and it was me who lost my cool and hung up on him. But I make no apologies for it. That guy fucking deserved it. But sorry, I lost my train of thought. Can you remind me what direction?
It was about the ratio of well-meaning conversations.
Oh
to,
yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's been like overwhelmingly positive. But that being said, if there's anyone listening right now who doesn't like anything I've said, or maybe has objections to common talking points around trans rights that they've heard, that want to call in to either Here Tonight or to Transatlantic on Saturdays at 5 Central, please do. We are waiting for those calls. Katie and I want more of those challenging calls, because it not only does it make for good content, but it's also more exercise for us and our brains. Like, while I love giving advice, there's only so many pieces of advice that I have to give, but I have an endless supply of a need to be right.
And that's in a way, that's why I'm glad that there are shows like yours, like Atheist Experience and Talk Heathen, because there are a lot of and I see this in family a lot. There are a lot of family members who will try to bully another family member who, they don't know the right talking points. They don't know how to properly defend a belief or how to properly talk about what they're feeling, and then that's gonna get used against them right in the right at the dinner table. It's like, well, you can't even explain this, so why should we take you seriously? And that's why we have shows like this. We are willing to stand up here and take those shots for you. And we will, one thing that we do is, of course, answer those questions, but also we're here giving you the ammunition. We're here saying, here's ways that you can talk. But let's talk to a different group of people for a second, really quick. And instead of going from the internet, let's take this like personal. Okay. How do you even, what's the proper way? And is it just plain improper to take someone that in real life who has, like, for me, I'm atheist, for you, you're trans. What's the proper way to begin asking them questions that you might be curious about?
I mean, I really think it's along the same lines. Like, I love intellectual conversations. I love hashing out like what really is, and working through objections and things like that. I find that stuff entertaining and enjoyable because it makes me feel like I've gotten closer to the truth. And the next time I'm in like a debate with someone, I feel like I have a stronger position or whatever to base off of. Um, like my family growing up, my environment was all very religious. They are not interested in debating whether or not it's reasonable to believe in a god or gods. Uh, but I think even to that end, I have had conversations with people, you know, after like in college and in like relationships and dating and things like that, who have been more interested in those conversations. And I think that's really interesting. I think if you feel convinced of your position and you have done work to be secure internally, to know that your self-worth is coming from within, like your self-worth isn't coming from whether or not you convince this person or whether or not they convince you, um, then I think as long as they respect you, there is always room for having these conversations, or at least there should be. Um, I think the issue is just that a lot of the times these issues, especially around trans issues, but also in regards to atheism, a lot of the times people are poisoning the well right off the bat. Whether you're saying men choose to identify as women, or whether you're saying like, how do you even have meaning in your life? Like, you're kind of kicking off the conversation with the assumption that I am this like terrible creature from like the depths of darkness. It's uh, if you approach me with like, I genuinely have an honest conversation here that I want to start because I want to either be more respectful of you if like your position is genuinely the true one, that like it's genuinely a true position, or nope, I lost my train of thought again. I'm sorry, I'm all over the place tonight.
No, it's fine. And this is a conversation that's so big. We could spend an entire hour and a half talking about this only. We are getting a number of calls, and I'm very happy to see that. And please, if you do have anything that you want to talk about, or if you have that someone who always had the questions that you don't know how to answer, we're the people to send them to. Give them our phone number, get them in the chat, and we'll get this going. The queue's starting to fill up. This is going to be a good show. Okay, so you use the phrase there, choose, right? And don't I recall that you just had a debate recently where a good chunk of it was around the word choose? And
by golly, I did.
and never mind the actual debate itself, which if people want to watch, it's a good one. It's a corker. But it's these little things where you're keen to it, you're aware of these words, these dog whistles, whereas someone like me, it might just be that's just the word that we use. So how do I start to be more aware of saying something and knowing how insensitive it might be, and then learning how to correct that?
See, I think that the wrong approach is to try to preemptively guess what words are offensive and what words aren't offensive. I think the right method is to realize that being wrong isn't a bad thing, and that making an apology doesn't hurt your reputation. If anything, it should bolster it. If someone says, hey, like saying men choose to be women is like, first of all, misgendering trans people, and it's a misunderstanding of what it means to be trans. Being trans isn't something someone has a choice over. So in that case, I think it would be good for the person who said that to say, if they want to stick by that position, that's fine. They're entitled to do so. They don't owe anyone an apology. But if they don't want transphobia tied to their reputation, I think they owe it to themselves to say, like, oh, whoops, someone pointed out to me that this sort of language is regularly used to invalidate like the gender of people who are trans. Seems like the evidence shows that people don't actually choose to be trans. I was wrong. Sorry, my bad. For me, I have a pretty strong policy of I have hard boundaries, but I don't hold grudges. So if people say things that are like transphobic or something, I'm probably going to draw a hard boundary and probably not be your friend while you're holding to that position. But if you come to me and you say, like, if you either convince me that I was wrong, or you say, oops, I realized that actually I think you're right and I shouldn't be holding this position, my bad, I'll try to be more cautious of that going forward. Water under the bridge, that's fine. I think it's a far more productive method to be willing to make mistakes and to be willing to apologize for mistakes than to try to anticipate every little nuance and quirk of what could potentially interrupt conversations. Now, that being said, I think there are some recurring patterns that are maybe like generally like more thought of. Like, for example, you wouldn't say that like, oh, actually all people are straight and they choose to be gay, or they, straight, or, just someone choosing to be a homosexual or something along those lines. I think we'd all recognize that as a common talking point that religious people have been using for decades to try to vilify the gay community. But suddenly when it's used on trans people, it's not as clear. Like, I recognize maybe it hasn't been used on trans people as many times, so it genuinely isn't as easy for people to recognize. If that's the case, that's fine. But it would just be nice if in response, people weren't like, actually, you're wrong. That's not what this means. And goes, oh, actually, you're right. I see that connection. And that is not the scientific position to say that. So therefore, I will try my best, at least, to be cautious of that, or conscious rather of that going forward.
No, and I am like living proof that like there's a lot that I don't understand. And Arden, you know this because we have conversations on top of conversations. But despite that, we're friends, and we have that after show that we do on Saturdays after the Transatlantic Call-In show, where we just hang out in World of Warcraft for a couple of hours and entertain your guests, and we're still functional friends at this, even though there's a lot that I don't understand. And so it is possible to be underinformed and still be an ally. So
absolutely.
What is the best thing that people can do? They know they want to support you. They know that you have, the science on your side, but they just don't know it themselves. What is the best thing that we can do? What's the best way that we can head conversations off, or interact with you or other people? What's the best way that we can be an ally, even though we're underinformed?
I mean, having these conversations, like calling into Transatlantic and being like, hey, I don't understand this one issue. I hear this a lot in the community, but I don't find it entirely convincing on its face. Can you either like give me better evidence, or maybe give me a different argument or a different understanding of this that can like help better? Or just earlier today, I was talking to Johnny Angel. I'm sure everyone here knows Johnny, about whether or not it's immoral for a trans person to not disclose their trans status to someone before going on a date, or before engaging in like sexual intimacy or something along those lines. I mean, those are conversations that I think, especially with like Johnny, for example, I've known Johnny and Johnny respects me, and I know Johnny isn't trying to like undermine me or make me out to be this like, siren sitting on the rocks calling sailors into the rocky water so they'll drown and I can feast upon his like flesh. Like, no, he's genuinely trying to get to the truth of the matter, which is good. I'm totally down for helping people work through problems and like logic them out. Yeah, and if people aren't informed, I think it's a lot of the same thing where like for the things that you do know, don't be afraid to talk on them. If you see someone saying something that's anti-science and you know the counter arguments to it, being an ally, your voice as a cis person, people might object to this, I think weighs more in public discourse. I think people genuinely, when a cis person says, actually, no, this is what, the evidence for the efficacy of transition is, people are going to respect that slightly more than if I do, because they're going to think I have a biased source, or something. I'm a biased, conveyor of information. So if you have that info, don't be afraid to use it. But I think furthermore, don't be afraid to. It's the same kind of thing of like when to, be careful about conversation or whatever. Like, don't worry about that. Forget that whole thing. Barrel forward, and if you make a mistake, just don't be afraid to correct it. That I think that's a much healthier perspective, and you're going to get to the truth a lot faster that way.
Well, we're going to get to calls in a few minutes. Now, if you've been noticing the past 20 minutes or so, I've been very careful not to talk about your your typical trans issue questions. What my goal here is to try to not just have a good conversation here, but to help create a template for people to have better conversations elsewhere also, right? Because this is but one conversation. There's going to be the people who are listening on the podcast. They're going to be the people who are listening and on YouTube, and they're going to be having conversations out there. And it is my hope that I am doing my share to help those conversations be better. I can only have so many. You can have many more than I can. And if we can help you have better conversations, then we are doing our job. Arden, what's your last thought on that? And then we'll get some announcements and we'll take calls.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I think sometimes I'm careful about the phrase better conversations, because sometimes that means being overly charitable to people who don't deserve it. At the end of the day, I want a change in minds broadly. And sometimes, unfortunately, I think that means having a call where I lay out a bunch of evidence and make a caller kind of feel bad about themselves a little bit and then hang up on him. And then we should talk him after the fact because he was spreading, anti-trans like propaganda that's not based in fact or science or anything. And I think sometimes that's part of having better conversations, because if someone is spreading anti-trans conspiracy at a time where, trans healthcare is being taken away from minors and it's giving them these internationally recognized best medical practice is being portrayed by legislators as child abuse, that position needs to be called out, and that person needs to feel embarrassed to hold that position, because that position is actively harming children and ruining the lives of like minors. So I think with that in mind, generally I do want to be charitable and have conversation, but I think it's just good to keep in mind that sometimes that's not always the best course of action, and there are different methods that are effective in different situations.
Well, let's start having those conversations. But first, I did want to say that this show thrives on the donations of volunteers like you. One fantastic way to do it is through our Patreon. That's patreon.com/truthwanted. And every week we will call out our very special patron of the week. And this week is no exception. So if I could have a drum roll, please, we will announce the patron of the week. It's more fun with an actual drum roll. Don Nelson. Don, thank you very much for being a patron of the show. This could be you. Go ahead and go to our Patreon and go ahead and donate and help us out. Okay, Arden, are you ready for this?
Yeah. Do we have? Wait, isn't there a thing you wanted to do after the patron of the week?
Wow, that's really embarrassing that I forgot. So
Yikes.
Today's a very special day that, of course, Arden had to remind me of, and now I'm really embarrassed. But today is my 10-year wedding anniversary. Mrs. Puck and I have been married for 10 years. Oh, thank you guys very much.
Sorry to roast you on
you absolutely had to roast me, and for a while there I was like, wait, what am I forgetting? There's so much on the host responsibilities. I'm looking at the notes I'm supposed to talk about later. I'm supposed to talk about all the other stuff on there.
We'll get there.
Yeah. Okay, but let's see. We got a call here.